Good day to you. I don't know if you saw the news from yesterday, but one of the things making its rounds, probably in many of your social media feeds, is a story about Representative Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, AOC as she is known. She's representing a district of New York in Washington. And she went on the floor of the House of Representatives yesterday in an hour-long speech to talk about how she was called, quote, a fucking bitch by a male representative on the steps of the Capitol building. And so she went on the floor of the House to denounce what had happened. And I'm not talking about this to start class today to make a point about Democrats or Republicans. She's a Democrat, and I don't want to go down that path. What I'm wanting to do instead is to ask, would that have happened in a reverse situation? Would you have had a woman approaching a male who are both representatives, and because of her disagreement with his political positions, would she, on the steps of the Capitol building, have called him a fucking bastard? And would fucking bastard even be equivalent in harshness and tone and vulgarity to fucking bitch? I don't think so. It's a lesser term to me. Bitch is both bastard and bitch are discussing sexuality. Bitch is coming from a female dog, and bastard is coming from a male from quote unquote unmarried parents. So these terms in and of themselves do not have equality. And that's opening up our discussion today, which is about gender and culture, but really it's mostly this chapter about women. And I think very much about my own situation here at East Stroudsburg University. My wife is a professor. She's a chairperson of the Department of Academic Enrichment and Learning. But she had to toil away for 10 years in a part-time and non-tenure track position before she got a chance to have the position that she has now. And for me, I was hired directly from Cal State San Bernardino. So in the United States, we have many examples like this, which are going to be illustrated in our chapter today, in our discussion about how equality for women is still a struggle. So let's make the point, first of all, that for many centuries, the female body wasn't even considered to be a separate set of organic qualities. I'm kind of using clumsy wording there. It was not considered to be a separate entity, let's put it that way, until, the 1800s. The female body used to be a part of the male body. That's how it used to be considered. So only in the 1800s did the idea of sexuality and gender even come to be considered. And what is the difference between sex and gender? Well, sex is what you are biologically born with. It's your genitals. Whereas gender is how you are communicated with by the society you live in by virtue of the gender that you have. Men should wear blue and girls should wear pink. Those kinds of things are what define people's gender throughout life. And in the area of scholarship, and particularly scholarship in the field of communication, gender used to be thought of as a binary concept. That means either you're male or you're female. But communication, among other fields, has been on conducting leading research to break out of seeing gender as binary and seeing that there actually can be, I won't say multiple genders. That's how Fred Yant refers to the development in the chapter. I'm going to say a sliding scale of increments when it comes to gender. So you can have somebody at this end of the spectrum who's very, very female and somebody at this end of the spectrum who's very, very male. And then you go down the middle with each increment. You can have people who have dimensions that are feminine and masculine, and you can have people who are equal, feminine, so on. And I think that the Jenner family, Bruce Jenner and then Caitlyn Jenner, when he went through transitioning to a female, did a lot about 5-6 years ago to elevate the profile of transgender people in our culture as well. So this is part of a national discussion that the U.S. is starting to have. According to Yant, people start to know what their gender is by the age of 3. They know if they are born into a man's body and they don't feel comfortable, they feel more like a woman by the age of 3. They know if they are born into a man's body and they do feel comfortable as a man, they know by the age of 3. The term cisgender, CIS, gender, is used to refer to somebody who identifies in their adulthood with how they were born gender-wise, born sex-wise at birth, cisgender versus transgender. And there are lots of traditions of of people who are representing both genders and a non-binary view of gender throughout history. It's not new. It's not just the Jenner family that has brought that up. You can look at the Navajo Indians, the Navajo Native Americans, the Navajo Nation, mostly located out in New Mexico, and they had a group of people called Nadals, or Nadals perhaps is how it's pronounced, Nadles, and they performed female tasks dressed up as women. Some of those tasks involve, for example, caretaking. They would dress up as women. So that's a third gender, so to speak, born male, but performing in ways that are traditionally female. That's what the Nadals used to do. And if we revert to a term that we didn't really cover last class that I do want to mention now because it's going to come to play in our material here today, one of the value dimensions of culture that was studied was the masculinity versus femininity dimension. And that's often misunderstood. It's misunderstood to say, if you look at the U.S., is it mostly masculine or mostly feminine? The average person would say, well, gee, is it aggressive like men are, or is it caring and nurturing like women are? And that's what's going to determine whether it's masculine or feminine. That's not what this term refers to. And that's not what these terms refer to. Masculinity refers to the degree to which, in a culture, the roles between men and women are clearly defined and clearly different. So in masculine cultures, typically what you see is the female is in the house and is supposed to care for the children and is supposed to keep the house clean, and the male is supposed to bring home the food, bring home the income, etc. That's a masculine culture in the extreme. In a feminine culture, you have more equality. You have less differences between men and women. You can have a female prime minister. You can have a female who's the coach of a major sport. That's a feminine culture. So that's what we're going to be exploring a little bit later in the class today. Let's talk about a study that was done by the United Nations now. Actually, the chapter is full of studies, and you will find many charts and many figures, and I encourage you to mull over those with your eyes and see where the U.S. falls on these different measures of gender equality. One of the indices, that's a plural of the term index, that was developed by the United Nations is a Human Development Index. And what it does is it measures your life expectancy, it measures how knowledgeable you are by the time that you pass away, and it measures your standard of living. And what this study found was that no country treats women as well as it treats men. There is no country where there is total equality. An amazing statement, is it not? And that the Gender Inequality Index, which is another calculation, looks at maternal mortality, that means women who die as a result of childbirth, adolescent fertility, the ability to give birth as a young person, higher education, and then workforce participation. And the U.S. does pretty well here. Out of 200 countries, it ranks eighth in the world. The Netherlands is the best, followed by Australia, followed by Switzerland, followed by Denmark. The most equal country in the world for men and women is the Netherlands. And also, this study found that income is not actually related to equality. There can be equality in terms of access to health care. There can be equality for men and women in terms of access to education. But if they have those areas of equality, it doesn't mean their income is going to be equal either, as we will see. So let's move to the World Economic Forum study now, another study that's taking place looking at women. It's based on health, education, politics, and economic opportunity. And there are 4 categories that it takes a look at in comparing men and women. The first is health and survival. And if you look at the birth rate of men to women in countries, generally speaking, it's more males than women. And that's in part skewed by countries such as China and India that have a favoritism towards male. You may not know this, but China had a one-child policy for many, many years, which it is now modified to a 2-child policy. And that means that's as many children as you're allowed to have in China to slow the population growth. They have so many people in China. But what that has done is it's placed a premium on having a male, be that one child or those 2 child, to pass down the family name, to pass down the lineage, to pass down, in essence, gender inequality. And so health and survival looks at those countries that have a ratio of 1.1 men to 1 female being born, and where there's slightly more men, and there's going to be a greater disparity between health and survival in those countries than countries where there you have equal amounts of men and women being born. And those countries where there are great disparities include Vietnam, China, Hong Kong, and India. We know in general that in developing countries, and by the way, we don't use the word third world countries anymore. Third world refers to countries that used to not be aligned with the Soviet Union or the United States. So they were third world countries, a very derogatory term. We don't use that. We call them developing countries, like Ghana, which I've referred to several times in this class, and even Mexico. In developing countries, women, generally speaking, have poor access to education. There are barriers. At the same time, we have the massive worldwide sex trafficking industry. Each year, about 800,000 women and girls are coerced into sex trafficking, mostly by Asian traffickers. And even beyond that, 1 out of every 3 women, according to Yount, across the world will experience sexual violence at some point. Now let's move on to the second area that's being compared by this World Economic Forum study, and that's educational attainment. And the book starts to talk about a gap being closed. And what that is it starts with the premise that there's a huge gap in equality between men and women on income, education, and lots of other dimensions, which you can read about in the chapter. So the question is, how much of that gap is being closed? And in the area of education across the world, 95% of the gap in educational attainment has been closed. That's great. That means women have a lot more access. But at the same time, if you look at the illiterate people in the world, people who cannot read, that's what illiteracy technically means, 2/3 of them are women. So if you have that much more women, proportionally speaking, who are unable to read, they are unable to access education. And yet in higher education today, more women are enrolled than men. Here at ESU, that certainly is the case. And not only do you have 53%, 54% more women than men here at ESU, you also have higher graduation rates for women, which is to say that more men are dropping out after their freshman year, their sophomore year, their senior year. So the United States is poised for a future of more educated women than men, and we will see whether that will play out in terms of economic equality. Speaking of economic participation and opportunity, that's the third category of this study. 54% of working age women are employed. 54%. That means 46% are, if they're able to work, are not employed across the world. And that's compared to 81% for men. 81% of working men compared to 54% of working women are employed across the world. And it gets worse when you start looking at leadership positions. Women make up only 14% of corporation boards. 14% across the world. That's paltry. Wage-wise, across the world, women are earning 59% of what men earn. Here in the United States, it's higher. I believe it's around 80% or 80 cents on the dollar. But that's still 20 cents less that the average woman with the same qualifications as a male is making compared to if a male had that. We do have a law that's tried to correct that. It's called the 1963 Equal Pay Act. Excuse me, but it has not had the desired effect yet. And also, when you look at people who are living in poverty, 70% of those people are women. 70%, disproportionate. Now let's look at political participation. This is what I opened up class with that example of a female representative being harassed, and that's a barrier to succeeding in her position, or could be if she lets it. You can watch her speech and see what she had to say about that. But this is what we're talking about, political participation. Only 20% of that gap has been closed. Only 20%. So women, in a way, when it comes to the political process, more than the economic process, this is where they are being shut out of more than men. If you look across the world, only 22% of parliaments are made up of women, or of governments are made up of women. And there are no women in government in Qatar, Palau, Tonga, and Vanuatu. Those are Pacific islands. You don't probably hear about them that much. Some countries, such as India, have tried to correct this by putting quotas in and saying you have to have 1/3 of the legislature has to be females. And actually that has worked for the country of Rwanda. Rwanda is the first country in the history of the world to have a majority of female representatives. And that's right in the heart of Africa. Rwanda, the first country. Now let's look at regions and areas and make some stereotypical descriptions of male and female and multiple gender approaches, and look at the equality of the multiple gender approach. If we look at Nordic countries, which I've been to many times, are going to be Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, which I've also been to, and Finland. Finland is kind of a different country. I've been there as well. It's got a different language. It's more like Hungarian, whereas the other languages are Scandinavian. But they come from a common heritage. They're all known as Nordic countries. And Iceland is the country that has closed the gender gap across all areas more than any other country in the world. 87% of the gender gap has been closed in Iceland. And actually the Nordic countries rank the highest in femininity versus masculinity. That means the roles that are defined for men and women are less distinctive in these feminist countries, and men can do what are traditionally thought of as female jobs, such as taking care of kids. In Sweden, for example, the male gets the exact same amount of time off from work, paid family leave, if they want to, that the woman gets to have. And that's even a reverse bias against men in our country. So this is what we're looking at in the Nordic countries. And Sweden, mentioning Sweden, was one of the first countries to engineer gender-neutral language. You know, the word for her and he they've gone with is hen, which means they, but they not in a plural sense, but that person, so that her and he is not going to be distinguish a person's by their using language to distinguish their gender. Compare this to Mexico. Mexico is very high on the masculinity index. It's got a lot of male chauvinism. There are high rates of physical and sexual violence that exist in Mexico today, and it's just almost understood that if you're a Mexican male that you can have a mistress, and the Mexican female not only might know about it, but is not even able to talk about it in the marriage, because it's just one of those embedded power inequalities that still exist in Mexican society. And so women's rights are improving, though. There is more political participation, and there are laws protecting women to be able to own land, and the value of the machismo personality is diminishing in Mexico, but it has a long way to go, in part because the Virgin of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Guadalupe, is their most important religious figure, and that person by herself, the Virgin, symbolizes that it should be important for a woman to have her virginity, and that also suffering and sacrifice are part of being a woman. So they have to navigate that cultural icon that they idolize in order to gain more equality, in my opinion. The life expectancy in Mexico is higher for women. It's lower than compared to across the world. 79 is the age the average woman lives to in Mexico, and it's 73 for men. When it comes to the labor market, women are really shut out, and the jobs that they're doing, I've seen them doing lots of jobs. It's lots of making things, cooking, making clothes, making jewelry. Yeah, so you might not be surprised that 80% of men who are able to work are participating in the labor market, but only 45% of women in Mexico. And when they do, you know what kinds of jobs they are. I just mentioned them. China's up next. China has that Confucian tradition, which has a male superiority to it. The boys are valued more than girls. Women, traditionally, according to the Confucian tradition, are supposed to serve fathers. They're supposed to serve the male figure of the household that's leading the household. Women are supposed to serve fathers, sons, husbands. Women serve. Actually, there were concubine laws before the communists. Concubine laws that made a woman the property of a male to use mostly for sexual activity. So the communists abolished those concubine laws and actually gave women the right to own property and to choose husbands, which was not possible before, and to divorce. But because of the two-children policy that's in China today, you have a lot of children trafficking, and some of that is sex trafficking. Children, if they're not a male, being sold. You know, if you want to be an adoptive parent, and you can't find a child for adoption in the United States, your next option is going to be China, because of this the very law of two children. Now let's go on to Japan. Japan does not do well in gender equality. It ranks 26. You know, I guess that's okay, but 26 is still pretty low for an advanced country. And in the 12th century, that's when you first had female rights being asserted, with the women could finally, in the 12th century, own and manage their own property. But at the same time, the Meiji Civil Code of 1898, which is just over 100 years old, it denied women legal rights and subjected them to their husband's will. So Japan is very high in masculinity. But at the same time, it's extremely high on women's health. Women's health is very good numbers-wise. They live significantly longer than men, and they live to a good age compared to Mexico. 89 years old is what the average woman in Japan lives to versus 82 for a men. In the Japanese legislatures, you still find only 13% of the legislatures are made up of female representatives. Now let's go on to South Korea. South Korea also has a Confucian tradition of duty to husband, duty to a husband's family. And there was a tradition there that a woman who did not deliver a healthy son could be driven from the household. Can you imagine that? The eldest son, there's even a pecking order within the masculinity structure there. The eldest son is held in the highest esteem. And a bride to a husband is expected to adapt to the husband's household ways. Whatever the traditions are of the husband, that's what the wife has to adapt to. And not surprisingly, in Parliament, female participation is only 15.7%. Just about a tenth of the population of representatives are females. Moving to India now. India has Hinduism, you may know. It's got a thriving economy, but at the same time, there are 300 million people in poverty. How can that be? The literacy rate for women in India is only 47%. Unbelievable. There's been a lot of violence against women over the years that have been reported in the media. A lot of gang rapes that you might have seen that are coming out of India. I'm not sure whether it's occurring anywhere else, occurring more than anywhere else in the world, but that seems to be how India is often reported on. And girls still today come with a dowry. You know what that is, right? It's when you marry into a female family, you get with it a nice purse. That's even a female word, I should say, a treasure. You get a financial package that comes with it. That's expected. It's called a dowry. So there's a high rate of female infanticide too that is still trying to be figured out, why women are dying. There's a lot of abortions that take place to unwanted parents. And at the same time, there's laws against doctors giving out this information. So that's why it's so difficult to discover. You start to see some of the embedded barriers to male-female equality when you see drill down and see some of the laws that are in place. Let's move on to sub-Sahara Africa now. Zimbabwe being an example. These are very patriarchal societies too, built on tribal societies. A tribal leader is often, but not always, a male. In Congo, almost 1,200 women are raped every single day. It's sort of seen as a normalcy throughout much of Africa. Women have more rights in countries that fought against colonial rule. So those countries such as Ghana, for example, which fought against colonial rule, the Ivory Coast, which fought against French colonial rule, they tend to have more women's rights. Unfortunately, sub-Sahara Africa has half of the world's maternal, newborn, and child deaths. Half in that tiny region of the world. Let's go into the Arab states now. Arab states, the disparities between women and men are perhaps the greatest in the whole world. Female infants born a female used to be able to be buried alive in pre-Islamic Arabia. That was seen as a practice to do away with a problem. The Quran did revolutionize life for women. It equalized women in God's eyes, but the actual practices has not met Islam's ideals. Patriarchal conditions still exist. A man is considered as the descendant only of his father and his father's family. That only the man has that occupation. And actually, Muslim men can legally have 4 wives at once. And you know the story about meeting so many virgins once a Muslim passes away. And a woman can only marry one man. So a man can terminate a marriage very easily by just saying, I divorce you in front of a witness. So a female doesn't have that luxury. In Saudi Arabia, a country that we've discussed already, no woman can sit on the king's cabinet. Woman in 1999 1999 only started to get to drive cars during daylight only with the husband's written permission. 1999. All public facilities are segregated by sex. You go out, there's the men's area and the women's area. Yeah, pretty amazing. You think about bathrooms, right? Bathrooms are mentioned in the book. Why do we still have male and female bathrooms? Now, some will say, well, that's for the courtesy of the male and the females. They have different health needs. But when it comes right down to it, we all use the same thing, which is a toilet. And many countries have recognized that, and they have, well, in Sweden, they call them flex rooms to accommodate different views of gender, and it's a bathroom for everybody. And I wonder if that's one way in our social fabric that we can continue to promote the path of equality. Let's look at the institution of marriage now. Marriage in those collectivist countries, you will find brides are often very different in age from their male counterpart, very, very much younger, and you will find more marriage based on marriage by virtue of wealth. And the marriage partner for women is usually chosen in collectivist countries. In more masculine countries, countries where those gender roles are really defined, the boyfriend, the potential boyfriend, if you're looking at opposite sex romance here that leads to marriage, the boyfriends are said to, it's all about the personality, intelligence, the sense of humor. I asked the American women in this class who are heterosexual, is that how you have been cultured to appreciate male? It's based on this, not so much on looks. It's the opposite for men. We have been cultured in the United States to evaluate a woman based on her looks. In Western countries, marriage has waned somewhat, in part because of divorce rates. Divorce rates are soaring in lots of places, even China. And in the U.S., more than one half of the families are divorced. In fact, 62% of people who marry in the United States are divorced. So that institution continues to be one that is looked at as, is it a safeguard of gender equality, or is it a place where gender equality becomes manifested, which erupts in a divorce? Let's look at the family as a whole now, the family unit. You have many different structures of families across the world, somewhat based on gender. In more collectivist countries, more countries that are based on group behavior rather than individualism, your Latin America, your Asian countries, you have more of extended family living in the home. This extended family can be your grandparents, it can be your aunts, your uncles, your nephews. You can have a household where that's expected, that the grandmother and grandfather is not expected to be put in a nursing home in those families. In our country, we have a nuclear family concept for the most part. That means the immediate family, the ones that you were born into with, the husband, wife, and then kids. That's what we see as being a family. Now, the way that marriage is conducted within the family unit, to tie these two concepts together, you have a term called exogamy. Exogamy, E-X-O-G-A-M-Y. And that's where you marry outside a defined group. So it could be somebody who's a different race from you, it could be somebody who has a different income background, it could be somebody from a different geography and compared to where you live. Whereas endogamy is marrying within a defined group. It's marrying within, if you're Italian, you need to marry a good Catholic Italian boy. You need to marry a good Jewish male. This is what we're talking about here. You can look at a lot of the family types on page 281. It lists them for various countries. Very interesting to take a look at. Now let's move to non-binary gender identities. And I thought that Fred Yant would have spent more time on this. I've seen this chapter revised over the years, and this was only had a very small piece of the chapter. There's in India 500,000 transgendered people. And actually non-binary people, which would be transgendered people, they're neither masculine or feminine in the strict traditional sense. Non-binary people have long been part of histories, of civilizations. In Mexico, for example, and also in Thailand. In Thailand, you have the Tahoes, people that were known to be both genders or neither gender. Now let's move on to gender expression. Gender expression, a lot of our language helps to perpetuate the differences between men and women in Latin-based languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese. Those languages still distinguish between men and women by having masculine and feminine versions of words. You know, Latino versus Latina. That's a male Latin person versus a female Latin person. So language itself perpetuates differences. We know across the world that women are more likely to use language when they speak to express feelings. whereas men are more likely to use language to compete with each other. Now, I'm not so sure that that is a universal proposition, to be honest, because I hear a lot of female conversations where, believe me, well, you don't have to believe me, you probably know for yourself, there's a lot of competition going on. So I'm not quite sure what domains that might be more true in than other areas. But we do know that language has a lack of counterpart words. I can say, hey guys, I'll see you later. That fits perfectly with guys. But what if there's a group of women? What do I say? Hey guys, see you later? I can say that, but hey gals? No, there's no counterpart to that. There's no counterpart to bitch. Bastard is not a counterpart. So we have a lot of words that are gender-based in our language that are loaded with more harshness towards women than we have towards men. It's just very difficult to find words. Is there a word that is as severe as the C word? I don't think so. So in some cultures, like in Zulu cultures in Africa, women and men actually have entirely different words that they have to use. And in China, women actually, because of the subjugation of them, they developed a secret language centuries ago called the Nushu language. So this is a very complicated issue, gender and communication, or woman in communication. As we start our ways through, it's not just simply do men and women have equality. There are a number of dimensions to consider when considering whether women and men have equality across cultures. Have a great day.